Our first speaker is Dr. Mark Crowe. Mark is from the UCD here in Ireland. He did a PhD on physiology in reproduction. He is board certified in the American College of Physiology, in animal physiology, and also board certified in the European College of Animal Reproduction. He has been awarded several prizes for his outstanding scientific work on animal reproduction, and he is currently professor in animal husbandry and reproduction here in UCD in Dublin. Mark, can I please ask you to come? And Mark will give a talk about dairy reproduction and what we can expect in the future for this dairy reproduction and what we veterinarians can do to stimulate the farmers to optimize the reproduction in the dairy herd. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Geert, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the organizing committee and the scientific committee for inviting me to address you here this morning in this very prestigious location in Dublin. I was given the title Dairy Reproduction, the Future, and I suppose with that title you could make it as wide or as narrow as you choose. So what we've tried to do is maybe highlight some of the things that I guess we're working on and just some of the things that may change somewhat in the future, or may facilitate some changes in reproductive management in the future. It's probably not complete, and there's probably lots of other ideas and suggestions out there. So if I haven't, or if I don't mention your pet idea, I apologize in advance for that. We're all very aware that in the last century, as we selected dairy cattle for milk production, we largely ignored fertility to our detriment, and we ended up with conception rates for dairy cattle dropping from in excess of 60% down to just under 40%. And that was largely due to a period when, using artificial insemination, we selected dairy cattle predominantly for increases in milk production. So in terms of what I'm going to try and discuss, I'm going to just a quick comment on the industry, some comments on data, and data is actually key to how we'll manage dairy cattle in the future, I believe. I have a number of slides on genetics and breeding strategies and a number of slides on fertility management. So that's how I've sort of structured the talk for this morning. So in terms of the industry, I guess the dairy industry is in a phase of rapid expansion at the moment, and certainly in Europe with the removal of quotas, certainly the larger dairy producing countries have sort of poised themselves for rapid expansion. And Ireland in particular, I think a couple of years ago, set out a policy document where we were going to expand milk output by 50% by 2020. That was when world market prices were a little bit better than they currently are. Now I think we're in a phase of challenge in terms of world market price, and that is certainly posing challenges for the dairy industry as it expands. In terms of herd management and herd fertility management, herd health management, I guess, has changed over the last 30 years from where we used to deal predominantly with individual clinical cases to where now we're managing that herd as an integrated unit. So it's been a massive shift in emphasis over the last 25, 30 years. And in more recent times, there's been massive expansion with the internet and the dot-com era and communication management, giving rise to massive amounts of data in all parts of life. But the dairy sector is no exception, and there's been massive increases in the amount of data that's available within the dairy sector. So I'll comment on that again on the next slide, I think. But certainly there's massive opportunities for increased veterinary intervention in herd health and herd management. So with the dot-com era and the internet era, data is king, and there's massive volumes of data. There's data of all sorts and types in terms of variety, in the speed at which it comes to us, so the velocity of it, the volatility. Some data is very clear-cut and very accurate, but some data is not. And there's lots of variation in the validity of some of the data. And I guess for herd health management, one of the big challenges is to actually capture that data in a way that we can actually use it to help us in an evidence-based approach as we manage dairy cattle and manage fertility in dairy herds. So we've got various sources of data. We've got batch data that, traditionally, the historical milk records we get will be batch data. It comes available every 4 or every 6 weeks, depending on the milk recording scheme that's in place. But as we go forward, there will be new types of milk records, and in particular, new phenotypes that can be measured in milk, and I'm going to comment on some of those. We have of course, a massive source of information through the genomic information. So when we genotype cows, there's absolutely massive quantities of data there. And then we've got diagnostic data, diagnostic information coming from herd visits. We also have data then that streams and can actually flow into a central repository. So here we're talking about data coming from sensors, and that could be herd level sensors measuring temperature, measuring humidity. Or it could be cow level sensors that are sort of measuring cow milk yields, or indeed internal devices measuring body temperature. So there's lots of sources of data. However, the big challenge is how we actually manage this data and how we actually utilize it in herd health management. And I suppose the other thing that we've discovered as part of a large EU grant that we're running is that it's really hard to sort of get clarity on ownership of some of the data that's available. It's really hard to get people to share data and to try and use that data in a way to benefit the whole dairy sector. So that there's a massive challenge there with this data to actually get it and use it in a meaningful way. I've just given 2 examples of 2 websites and companies that are involved with pulling together data into a useful platform to use, but I'm sure there are others as well. But it really is a challenge to capture these different data types and data sources and pull it together and actually be able to use that then in an effective manner for improvement of dairy herd fertility. Okay, so I'm going to switch and just comment a little bit about genetics and breeding. And in that, I'll talk about some of the trends in some of the existing phenotypes. I want to talk about some novel phenotypes and then very briefly comment on genomic markers. So in terms of existing phenotypes, and this is data from Ireland, and it's coming from the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, and it really has shown the change in our breeding indices. So back at the turn of the century, we predominantly were selecting cows based on milk production. When, in the early 2000s, we then shifted to including data on fertility and other traits as part of our breeding index, to the point now where milk yield is actually, and milk performance data is actually only 1/3 of the actual economic breeding index that we utilize in Ireland. So fertility is effectively a further third, and then there's various other indices that generate the economic breeding index. And with that change in the economic breeding index, what we see is that reproduction, as measured in calving interval, has actually started to recover. So calving interval was getting gradually longer until we got to the turn of the century, but then once we implemented the change in the economic breeding index, we actually start seeing a recovery and a decrease in calving interval. And I guess that's really important because it signifies to us that, in fact, genetically we are starting to once again improve fertility in dairy herds. And in Ireland, down in Teagasc Moor Park, they've established this herd which is known as the next generation herd, and that herd has got cows which are elite economic breeding index cows, and they've been selected for high EBIs, and associated with the high EBIs, then they're also better for all of the component traits within the EBI, so fat yield, protein yield, calving interval, and survival. And they have monitored the performance of these cows in this elite herd. And these are just the production data, so solid corrected milk here, marginally better than the national average, but fat and protein marginally better than the national average. But importantly for fertility, all of the fertility traits are actually better than what we're achieving nationally. So 3-week submission rate up at 95%, pregnancy to first service, 60%. We wouldn't have dreamt we'd be at that 10 or 15 years ago. 6-week pregnancy rate, 71%, in-calf rate at 12 weeks, 90%. And that's substantially higher than what the national average is achieving. So if we utilize the breeding indices appropriately, we can actually restore some of the problems that we've been seeing with fertility in dairy cattle. And just, I suppose, to emphasize that this is not just a genetic change in the sort of pasture-based, moderate yielding type cows that we would have in Ireland. These are data from higher yielding cows in the Netherlands, and on the data, or on the slide, are daughter pregnancy rate, both cow daughter pregnancy rates and sire daughter pregnancy rates. And you can also see here from around 2000 a general trend for recovery in these traits. So, whereas 10 years ago we were quite skeptical about the whole problem of fertility, I think genetically now we have got to the point where we are improving fertility once again, and that's good for the sector. Okay, also then I want to mention new phenotypes. So I'm involved with leading a project. It's a European project. It consists of 15 participants across 6 EU member states, plus China and the US. And one of the objectives is to try and develop new and to improve existing measurable phenotypes in milk. And so one of those phenotypes that we're looking at is mid-infrared spectra. Mid-infrared spectra, I suppose, for a number of years have been used to measure various traits in milk. But more recently, we can actually develop prediction equations that will fairly accurately identify cows that have difficulty from ketosis, cows that are lame, cows with uterine disease, potentially determine the time of resumption of ovulation by mid-infrared spectra, and potentially predict mastitis through prediction of the enzyme NA-gase in milk. So that's one potential new phenotype that's coming on board. A second approach that we've looked at is to try and use milk metabolites. And again, milk is an easily measurable matrix coming from dairy cattle. Most of the research data on a lot of the metabolites has generally been developed by measuring concentrations in blood. But the question we raised was, could we actually measure things in milk and predict these metabolites, using our milk measurements, predict the metabolites in blood, and indeed predict some of the diseases that can occur? And the answer is using, or I guess we have developed prediction equations with a reasonably high correlation here to actually predict some of these important blood metabolites and indeed disease incidences, mastitis, ketosis, and indeed residual feed intake. So I guess that's exciting in that it now allows us to measure things in milk and try and figure out what's going on in terms of actual phenotypes in cows. The other new phenotype that we're working on is measurement of glycans in the IgG fraction of milk. So pretty much all proteins, most proteins have sugar residues attached onto the protein. And the particular protein we're interested in is the IgG fraction of milk. We're interested in measuring those sugar residues attached onto the protein in milk. So what you do is you get your milk sample, you purify out the IgG fraction, and then you you cleave off the glycans, and then you run those glycans through UPLC. And you eventually get a UPLC trace where each peak effectively represents different carbohydrate groups that are attached onto the protein. And there's a massive explosion going on in sort of the whole area of glycoscience and glycobiology to actually use these glycomic traits as markers of health and disease traits, both in human medicine and now also in animal medicine. So we have tried to use glycans determined from the IgG fraction in milk to look at various disease traits, and certainly so far in the work we've done, we're able to predict very accurately cows that have retained placental membranes just purely on the basis of the IgG fraction after we fractionate out the IgGs, and likewise clinical mastitis. So we have further work to do to try and relate some of these glycan changes to other diseases and other health traits, but certainly there's enough evidence there to suggest that a milk-based glycan test is potentially useful going forward to sort of identify particular disease and health traits, some of which can be related to fertility. Okay, as a further part of this EU project, and we've just currently started this component, we're carrying out a genome-wide association study using some of the milk-based phenotypes that we've developed to try and relate genotype to phenotype. And we're currently recruiting or collecting samples from somewhere up to 15,000 cows across a number of EU member states, and collecting as much data as possible, as well as carrying out genomic evaluations of those cows. So that, I hope, will actually allow us specifically try and identify unique genes associated with some of the milk-based phenotypes that then are relevant to fertility and health traits for dairy cattle. Okay, I think yesterday we spent quite a bit of time discussing metabolic disorders, and I don't really want to reinvent the wheel here, but I guess for fertility, nutrition is absolutely critical, and some of the key items include trying to minimize the degree of negative energy balance, both in terms of the depth and the duration of negative energy balance, and to do that, again, it was discussed yesterday in some of the sessions, but we need to have cows calving at an appropriate body condition score. We need to try and minimize loss of body condition, and we need to try and, to do that, we need to try and maximize dry matter intake in cows. And there's been lots of data looking at specific components of the diet and their effects on reproduction, and certainly the data of Phil Garnsworthy talks about trying to, initially after calving, try and stimulate glucogenic type diets that will increase insulin so as to get cows cycling quickly after parturition. But we also know that that has a negative effect on oocyte and embryo quality, so then we need to shift the diet towards a more lipogenic type diet as a breeding diet. So there are things that are absolutely crucial in nutrition that will affect fertility going forwards. I don't want to dwell any further on that. I guess in the whole area of precision livestock farming, estrus detection is certainly an area that there's lots of potential to try and improve what we do. And the traditional approaches to try and help with estrus detection were to use tail paint camera devices, scratch cards, etc. Again, I'm not going to dwell on that. But going forward, I think there's going to be a rapid expansion in the amount of endocrine profiling that's done, and in particular with progesterone, and a massive increase in the use of sensors, whether it's activity monitors or whether it's pressure sensor devices, or maybe a combination of both to detect mounts and estrus activity. So just in terms of progesterone profiling, Delaval, being one of the major milk companies, milking machine companies, have developed a system described as Herd Navigator, and one of the things that it can measure are progesterone profiles. And if you measure progesterone profiles frequently enough in milk, you can then identify time of resumption of cyclicity based on those progesterone concentrations. Obviously then cyclicity status, and from those progesterone profiles infer when the likely time is for breeding. I don't think progesterone profiles will accurately enough predict the time of ovulation, so in my mind, we should be using progesterone profiles from this type of technology as a way to identify cows that need to then be observed more intensively for estrus, and then inseminate based on estrus, if somebody's using that technology alone. Of course, we also have activity monitor devices, and most of these, or some of these devices, consist of a neck collar. We've done quite a bit of work with the heat time device, but there's also the Moo monitor made by Dairy Master here in Ireland. But the heat time activity device, and indeed the Moo monitor, measures activity and tries to identify the increase in activity associated with estrus behavior. So we did a number of studies where we looked at progesterone profiles and related them to activity as determined by the heat time system. And certainly in the follicular phases, you can identify nice increases in activity, and the machine will identify these increases in activity, very much associated with the follicular phase. I suppose the downside is that we also found peaks in activity that were not as high, but certainly were associated with situations of high progesterone. So this is in a luteal phase here, this point here, point 2, and this point 4, also in an early luteal phase. And indeed down here in this bottom cow, we get apparent increases in activity during pregnancy. So certainly we can use these increases in activity to identify the follicular phase and identify timing of insemination, but there are errors, I think, as well that need to be filtered out. And I guess some of the companies that are working with these devices are trying to improve them on an ongoing basis and increase their accuracy at predicting time of estrus and indeed ovulation, and therefore time for insemination. And in our data set, again, these are just average duration of activity clusters, and these are the activity clusters for the cows if we had the collars on in time to get the first ovulation. So this is when progesterone, the first transition. So actually, at the first ovulation, we were picking up increases in activity. These were for subsequent ovulations after resumption of cyclicity, and these were very definitely the strongest levels of activity that we observed, both in terms of duration and peak activity. But then we also had these peaks identified by the equipment that were actually present during the luteal phase and in pregnancy. But yes, they were much lower and less intense levels of activity. So again, I think improvements are being made to try and filter out some of the noise and to try and improve the accuracy with which these devices can actually predict estrus and the optimum time for insemination. Okay, again, over the last sort of 15 years, there's been a massive increase in the use of timed artificial insemination. And when we're talking about synchronization of estrus and timed insemination, there's really three major strategies that you can use. You can either use prostaglandin on its own, which I don't intend to discuss at all today. That's been around for quite a long time. There's of-sync type strategies where you use GnRH to try and synchronize a follicular wave, and then use prostaglandin to short cycle, and then usually follow up with a second GnRH injection to induce ovulation. And then there are various derivatives of that type of strategy. And then there are progesterone-based treatments as well. In all of these treatments, what we're trying to do is manipulate the luteal phase and then bring the animal into a follicular phase, and ideally get a healthy dominant follicle capable of ovulation within a predictable 24-hour period that we can then time our insemination very accurately and get good pregnancy rates. So I'm not going to talk about prostaglandin on its own. Of-sync, I'm sure most of you are aware of. It's a GnRH injection followed by prostaglandin 7 days later, a second GnRH to time the actual ovulation, followed by insemination. And there's been lots of work done to look at the specific timings between the prostaglandin and the GnRH, and indeed between the GnRH and insemination, and some people even give the GnRH at the same time as the insemination in what's known as a co-sync. I suppose the downside of sync, well, the upside is that it allows you to use timed AI and basically submit all cows for breeding. The downside is that if you look across all of the literature that's been generated with sync on its own, is that at best it's achieving a 28 to 30% pregnancy per insemination. So it depends on your baseline and where you're coming from. For some herds, that's actually quite good, but for other herds that are starting at that level with naturals, detection of estrus and insemination to detected heat, and maybe doing a little bit better than that, then that's not necessarily a good proposition. So a number of years ago, we collaborated as part of a PhD program of Mary Herlihy with Milo Wilkbank, and we looked at the option of a pre-sync OVSync type protocol or a double OVSync. So pre-sync OVSync, for those of you who don't know, involves pre-synchronizing with prostaglandin. So prostaglandin day 0, 14 days later a second prostaglandin, and that of course works quite nicely where herd health visits are on a weekly basis. Ideally then 12 days later a GnRH injection, and that's what we did in the experimental work, followed by prostaglandin and GnRH. So this is the OVSync program, and it's been preceded by 2 injections of prostaglandin as a pre-sync. And we compared that with a double OVSync program, so that's basically an OVSync where we do not breed, followed by OVSync where we do our timed insemination. And with that work, we basically carried this out on 3 commercial herds in south central Wisconsin. There was 1,600 cows enrolled across 3 herds. And basically, the pregnancy per insemination for the double OVSync program went up to around 46% for double OVSync and 38% for the pre-sync OVSync. So if we assume our OVSync program was achieving a baseline of 28 to 30%, then that is a substantial improvement over that, going up to 38% for pre-sync OVSync and 46% for double OVSync. There were subtle differences between multiparous and primiparous cows, with primiparous cows overall achieving 47% pregnancies per insemination, compared with multiparous cows, 37%. We've also done, I suppose, quite a bit of work over the years with progesterone-based treatments, and again, I'm going to select the information that I present, but the basic progesterone treatment is insertion of a progesterone device and at the same time administering GnRH. That's followed by prostaglandin, usually 7 days later, and ideally removing the device on day 8. The license, I believe, for all the products available at the moment says remove it between 7 and 9 days, but as I say, our preference is to remove slightly earlier, either 7 or 8. We have a preference for giving the prostaglandin a day before removal of the device and then removing the device on day 8. There is then the option of following up with a GnRH injection if you want a fixed time inseminate, or quite often what we do in research activities is just breed to detected heats. So again, in a trial we conducted down in the south of Ireland with 1,600 dairy cows across 8 farms, we compared an 8-day CEDAR device where we inseminated in response to observed estrus, an 8-day CEDAR device where we followed up with a GnRH injection and conducted fixed-time AI, OVSync with fixed-time AI, and then a control group where we observed for estrus and bred to detected estrus. One of the difficulties when you work with commercial herds like this is when you go out to do a fertility trial, generally everybody ups their game, so even our control group actually has performed quite well. In any event, our submission rates, obviously for the fixed-time AI groups, should theoretically be 100%. There was a slight loss of compliance in a small number of cows, and that's why it's 98 instead of 100%. But importantly, the CEDAR, so the progesterone sync program, where we inseminated to detected estrus, we increased conception rates up to 57%, compared with 53% in the control group. And also, the calving to conception interval on the study for all of the programmed cows, so all of the synchronized cows, were significantly shorter than for the control group, the observed estrus group. In another study that's published in Theriogenology quite recently, we've tried to figure out does physiological status or disease status affect the response to synchronization with a progesterone program. So again, utilizing the standard progesterone program, GnRH at the start, prostaglandin a day before removal, removal of the device on day 8, and then we bred cows in response to detected estrus. And in this study, we enrolled 402 cows across 5 commercial herds. We measured various parameters, body condition score, locomotion score, mucus score, took blood samples for metabolites, and we carried out strategic ultrasound scans, and that was to allow us to categorize the cows into different physiological and disease classes, and then look at their response as to how well they synchronized in terms of estrus and subsequent pregnancy rates. So in this study, we had 170 cows that were classified as healthy, 21 that were in anovulatory anestrus, 56 that were clinically lame, 39 that had high cell counts, 52 that suffered severe energy balance loss, so they mobilized and lost body condition, more than half a body condition score unit over the first 35 days of the lactation, and 159 that had some form of uterine infection. When we looked at those that responded in estrus, we had a 91% estrus response rate in the healthy cows, and of course that dropped in all of the disease categories. I accept that some of these disease categories we have relatively few numbers of cows to make much sense out of it, but certainly there's a fall off in the numbers of cows or the percentage of cows that actually responded in estrus. And when we looked at those that came into estrus that then were diagnosed as pregnant, again, our healthy cows, we had 54% of the animals in estrus were pregnant, but that drops off in all of the disease groups, 35, 23, 30, 23, and 33%. So any of those diseases individually are having a negative effect on both synchrony rate to progesterone treatment and the proportion of animals that end up pregnant. And indeed, there were some individuals that had multiple diseases or multiple issues concurrently, and this slide just shows the healthy cows on the left, and then those with just one disease category, 2, 3, or 4 disease issues concurrently. And obviously the more of these disease issues that were present, then the poorer the response in terms of the percentage of animals that became in estrus and the percentage or the probability that those cows will actually conceive. So it's probably something that many of the practitioners would have told me anyway, but it just provides good hard data to show that if we have cows with problems, then yes, we can synchronize them, but don't expect them to perform as well as our healthy cows. Okay, so some of the things we can sort of discover from timed insemination studies, both the work we've done and work that's been done in North America, is that it's really important to try and manipulate progesterone around that periovular period. So as the follicle is growing and increasing in size, undergoing final maturation, ideally we should have relatively high progesterone, and we can do that by some of the pre-synchronization treatments that I've talked about, or you can do it by using progesterone devices. But then it's obviously critical that we're in a true follicular phase and we have low progesterone at the time of insemination, and some of the of-sync type protocols now are actually using 2 shots of prostaglandins a day apart as part of that program to ensure we get CL regression. The difficulty with that is to actually implement that on farms becomes really problematic. And the final thing is that animals should have a greater increase in progesterone during the early days after insemination to help with the establishment of pregnancy. And the other point, just from the data I've just presented, is that health status at the time of timed insemination, or as we're running that protocol, will affect the response to the program. Okay, just a few other sort of novel tools and ideas maybe coming forward. You remember the glycans that I talked about in terms of trying to develop or improve phenotypes that we can measure in milk. Well, we have also used glycans as a potential early pregnancy predictor, and we actually filed a patent for this back in November. But basically we can predict with a high degree of accuracy, greater than 95% sensitivity and specificity, from as early as day 16 non-pregnant from pregnant cows by combining the data across a number of those glycan peaks that I mentioned. And I suppose the challenge for us now is to actually bring that technology to the point where we can actually carry out a rapid test and get a result back to the farmer for pregnancy status on day 16, where the farmer can actually implement a decision then on day 17 or 18. So we could envisage in the future, if that test were to come to fruition, that we would put animals onto a timed insemination program, and it doesn't really matter which one, collect a milk sample day 16, and the early work we did was with serum, but we have also carried out work where we've validated this test in milk. So a milk sample day 16, obviously if she's pregnant, happy days. If she's not pregnant, put her straight onto some sort of a resync program, which might be just something as simple as a prostaglandin and a GnRH injection, and repeat another timed insemination. So if we could do that, that would very easily knock 10 or 15 days off a typical resync strategy. So that will be something that will be quite exciting in the future if we could get it to the point where that test will be rapid enough to give us time to actually carry out a resync. Okay, we also, as well as using activity monitors for estrus detection, there's also the potential to use activity monitors for health monitoring, and certainly the Dairy Master Moo monitor is quite good on that, and Edmund Harty, I think, is downstairs on the trade exhibit if some of you want to meet and discuss that particular device. There's also the possibility with Herd Navigator to measure other metabolites and use those as sort of potential disease markers or nutrition or metabolic status indicators. And I suppose I just didn't really want to ignore infectious disease, but you know, when we talk about reproductive herd health, we should, in our plan, include some sort of a strategy to deal with infectious diseases. And that strategy probably is dependent on the region. It's also dependent on the prevailing government strategies that are in place. But as a very minimum, or as a basic, there should be monitoring for disease status. Typically that's done by measuring antibodies in milk or in blood, and a vaccination strategy and an appropriate hygiene strategy for the disease in question. There probably should also be herd-specific standard operating procedures for buying in animals, for dealing with increases in abortion, and for dealing with repeat breeders. And there's newly emerging diseases such as blue tongue, where special attention probably should be paid. And the other area that I suppose I just didn't want to ignore, but I'm not sure that there's anything dramatic to change what we're doing, but that's the whole area of insemination techniques on the male side. And certainly there have been lots of studies specifically looking at site of deposition of semen, so deep intrauterine, or trying to place the semen ipsilateral to the dominant follicle, trying to time the insemination with regard to heat onset maybe at the beginning versus the end of heat. But to be honest, there's really no general consensus that any better results can be achieved over and above what's achieved currently with conventional insemination. So probably for practitioners and for herd health managers, it's probably better to just monitor whether or not insemination is in fact being carried out correctly and at the correct time in response to estrus, if insemination is being carried out with estrus detection, or adherence to the program if it's a timed insemination program. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude that I think the genetic trends for fertility are certainly showing that fertility can be improved by the appropriate genetic selection. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, the sort of things that we can see as being potential developments. Firstly, potentially novel phenotypes that might be measurable in milk, and that will help with genetic selection strategies, because one of the big issues has been trying to have something meaningful to measure for fertility and other traits when we're trying to measure phenotypes and improve our breeding programs for dairy cattle. I think there'll be specific genomic markers for specific fertility issues. I think between the work we're doing and others are doing, I think there's probably the potential for some early pregnancy detection marker that will allow us make decisions much earlier than currently is the case. Currently, ultrasound scanning, the best we can do generally is determine pregnancy status day 28 to 35, but it should be feasible to knock 10 or 12 or 15 days off of that and improve our strategies for resynchronization. I think there will be increased use of activity monitors, particularly as the technology probably comes down in cost and allows more farmers to actually invest in that technology. There definitely will be improvements, I think, to some of the breeding protocols in terms of how we manage progesterone around that peri-ovular period. And I think some of the automated measurements for inline measurements in milking machines probably will become more affordable, so something like the Delaval Herd Navigator system. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd just like to thank my co-authors and collaborators for their inputs into the various parts of the work that I've presented. So, Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your wonderful talk and giving a very nice overview concerning reproduction nowadays in dairy cows. And also thank for keeping in time. So we do have some time for questions. Please, if you have a question, go to the microphone, identify yourself, and go ahead asking a question.
Yeah.
Yes, there's the first question.
My name is Jan Huls. I work for Vetvice Cow Signals. I have a question about natural breeding versus the timed AI protocols. We see an immense oppression from society on the use of the hormone treatments for breeding cows. What strikes me in your presentation is that you put a lot of attention to timed AI, to programs in which you need about 5-6 injections to get an inferior result in pregnancy rates. So I would want to know why did you make that decision? Why did you not put more attention to support of visual heat detections? It will not, I think, moving forward on the timed AI protocols will isolate dairy industry from society. I think it's a dead-end road.
I agree with you in many respects, and I think a lot of the answer to that question depends on what country and what part of the world you're in when you're having those discussions. Also in Ireland, we do not use a lot of timed insemination programs. Our strategy nearly is always to breed to detected estrus. I guess I was conscious of speaking to a more global audience here, and there are people from all parts of the world. There are parts of the world, US, South America, where timed insemination programs are absolutely accepted and are substantially cheaper, and with some of the newer approaches are actually achieving higher pregnancy rates than are achievable by regular estrus detection. So I think the answer, it depends on the consumer population in the country as to whether or not these things are acceptable. Our farmers, for example, wouldn't entertain the use of a precinct OVSync program or a double OVSync program here in Ireland, mainly for two reasons. One is that there's either 5 or 6 injections. It's either a 28-day or a 33 or 4-day program, and each shot is probably costing in Ireland probably 5 or 6 euros a pop, whereas you go to North America and it's probably $2 or $3 a shot. So I think it's very dependent on the country-specific situation. It's also very dependent on the existing herd performance. So some herds are doing really well with estrus detection and are quite happy to work that way. And certainly, I think I included information on activity monitors. So if somebody's going to go an estrus detection route, probably activity monitors are the way to go, or some combination of activity monitors with maybe progesterone profiling. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question.
Michael McGowan, University of Queensland. Very nice presentation, Mark. I'm interested in if you could expand on how you see this new test, the N-glycan, to predict endometritis. Are you talking about taking a sample at the time of calving, or how were you looking at utilising that?
Yeah, so we have actually filed a patent on that as well. I didn't really mention that. N-glycan in milk can actually be used from around, well, basically in the region from day 14 to 21, in that window, to quite accurately identify cows with more severe, well, even with subclinical endometritis. So you could measure glycan changes at that time, somewhere between days 14 and 21, and identify cows with uterine health issues.
So do you think that in time this could be an inline test?
That is the difficulty with the technology. I think it could be very quickly, it could very quickly become a sort of a rapid lab test, but it's really quite difficult to switch it over to an inline test. Now there are ideas around it because you can actually get binders for some of these glycans, and if we could get the right binders for the right glycans of interest, then you could start thinking about an automated inline system. But until we have those, it's a rapid lab-based test that we will be using. So time will tell. I think there's possibilities, but I wouldn't like to be predicting it's within 3 to 5 years, probably more like 10 to 20 plus. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have time for 2 other questions.
Henderson from Brazil. Congratulations for your presentation. My doubt about what do you think about the protocol based on benzoate estradiol and progesterone and estradiols?
Use of estradiol in a progesterone program.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, the best progesterone program we had was an 8-day progesterone device with estradiol up front to manage the follicular wave population and leave the device in for 8 days with prostaglandin a day before removal. That, in my mind, was the best progesterone-based program. The problem is there's many parts of the world where that program is not permitted because estradiol has been banned. But there's no doubt in my mind that program would have been better in terms of synchrony rates and pregnancy rates than the progesterone sync program that we're currently using.
Yeah, because in Brazil, when you compare double of sync versus progesterone and estradiol, you have very bad results when you use estradiol and progesterone. Something like 20% with double of sync, 40% with estradiol and progesterone. Yeah. Because this is my question.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The problem is that in Europe, for example, estradiol is not permitted at all as part of the synchrony programs, and as a result, many other countries have actually stopped using it as well. But yeah, I agree.
One final question.
How about
Yeah, just interested really in your observations about genetic improvement. Mine is Peter Orpin, I'm a veterinary practitioner from Leicestershire. Been tracking a number of herds, about 4,000 cows, for 20 years now, and we've seen substantive improvement in fertility in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. And that's really been driven by improved health outcomes, nutrition, better lameness, better heat detection. And these have actually made a massive impact on fertility. And I just wonder whether it's correct to say, well, it's all just down to genetics, because I just really sort of see that there's quite a within variation, really, between herds. And the ones that grasp that seem to get the better fertility outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's actually quite hard sometimes to discern, some of the improvements on farm. Is it purely just genetic effect, or is it in fact better management? And for sure, those herds that manage things better are achieving far better results. So yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't want to disappoint you, so please, short question.
Yeah, how about I'm from the United States, how about the 5-day protocols on grass cattle, the 5-day cedar protocols? I've kind of liked those.
Yeah, so they're more for beef cattle, I think.
They work pretty well on bovines, I think, in general. But
I mean, the only slight difficulty with that's a 5-day progesterone program or a 5-day?
Yeah, just 5-day progesterone and then maybe a double shot of prostaglandin.
Yeah. So if you're leaving out the GnRH up front, then absolutely fine. If you're including a GnRH up front, then the problem with the 5-day is it's then too short to allow the CL to be responsive to prostaglandin. So
yeah, I've liked it, especially on heifers.
Yeah. Was that with or without the GnRH up front?
Correct.
Sorry, with or without?
Without.
Without, yeah. So those programs work quite well without GnRH, agreed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mark.